Good evening. Welcome to today's event. I first want to say I haven't been in this room for 13 years when I used to be at NYU, and it's so cool to be back here and really, really nice. So this is a special night for me, so I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you very much. For those of you who are new to the Brennan Center, probably none of you, but I thought I would say the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice. So they work for all Americans, and I can't think of a point in time when this hasn't been as important as it is right now. I'm Kareem Greenberg. I'm the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law, and I'm the co-editor with Julian Zelizer, to my right, of the book Our Nation at Risk, Election Integrity as a National Security Issue. And we're going to be talking about the election security today, but also many other things. And I have three panelists with us from the book. One is Julian Zelizer, who I mentioned co-edited the book with me. He's the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 41 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton. He's an award-winning author and the editor and author of, are you ready for this? More than 24 books. And I stopped counting after 24, so I just wanted to say that. To his right is Kareem Crayton, who you probably know. He's the Brennan Center's vice president for Washington, D.C. He oversees the center's work on voting rights and representation and has authored dozens of publications on the connections between race, politics, and representative institutions. So in other words, we have a lot of authors with us today. And finally, last but not least, Trevor Morrison, who at one time was the dean here and is now Dean Emeritus of the law school. He is the Eric M. and Laurie B. Roth Professor of Law here. He researches, teaches, and writes extensively. I guess that's what you have to do to be on this panel, on the federal courts and constitutional law with a focus on the separation of powers and federalism. Okay, let's get started. So Julian, this book is on election integrity and national security. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about why we decided to put those two things together. In some ways, it may sound a little obvious. Well, of course, you know, we have to protect this fundamental piece of American democracy. But I was hoping you could focus on integrity and what we really think election integrity entails and the challenges that you see for it.
Thank you, and it's nice to be with all of you. I think there was one level where we thought of the book in a straightforward way. This was in the wake of 2016 and 17, and it's here again today, where it is a national security issue in a straightforward way, interference in the election and the way in which you might see this from other countries. But I think it was broader than that. We really wanted to talk about comprehensively, what does it take to have a strong and robust democratic system. And we really wanted to I'm talking to you, but I guess I'm talking to the crowd actually, because we know what we wanted to do. But to have a system that is truly sound really requires looking at how elections work at multiple levels on different planes, from voting rights and the strength of those voting rights to state administration and the people who actually administer the law to the courts and how they're going to treat it. And I guess the hope was that to have a secure system and to have one that will make the democracy we boast about as good as it should be, requires looking at it and reforming it on all levels.
One further question. Is there one particular threat, vulnerability, or fragility in the system that particularly worries you, or is it more the combination of so many threats?
Well, I wrote about voting rights, but actually, as I think about it, the local is really, I think, a huge threat right now. We just saw what happened in Georgia and the empowerment of local board officials to disqualify votes or question them very easily and to tie up the process. And I think the local is actually right now where the action is in a bad way, and I think where some of the greatest vulnerabilities might be. We look in Washington, we look at the federal level, but I think that's where everyone has to keep their eye, and it also is local workers. I mean, just the security of poll workers to do their job and to do their work, and the people who will have to certify and administer in a good way. All of that, I think, it's an election of hope now, but we shouldn't forget the very real fears that were floating around and remain a top concern.
Kareem, that's a good segue to you in terms of how much is the local really, what's on your mind. I'm curious how you would define, because you talk about this a lot in your piece, how you actually think of election integrity, what you think are the most important parts of it, and then, again, following up on that, what really keeps you up at night in terms of, or if you could just say nothing keeps you up at night, that would be fine too.
I wish. Everything keeps me up at night in the election season. First, thank you for including me on this panel and as a part of the book. And I'm excited to be in conversation in this moment. I think it's helpful not just among people who think about this a lot to be a part of the conversation, but frankly, this election only works when all of us, whether you first thought about voting, this year, or you've been thinking about it, like many of us for most of our careers, it's important to be a part of the conversation. To answer your question, I'm reminded of, I should have put this in the book, I did not, a speech by Barbara Jordan, great Texan representative from a district outside of Houston or in Houston, and who Bill Clinton once described as the voice of God. In her speech at the Democratic Convention to nominate Bill Clinton for the first time, she started talking about his big theme, change. And her point to start was this profound reframing of it. She talked about change, but she says, of course, that begs a question, change from what and to what? And I think of election integrity in some of the same ways. That is, election integrity is intended to protect us from something, but there's also the part of election integrity that's intended to protect a thing, or perhaps a group. And what your answers are to either side of that, what are you protecting people from, and who are the people that you're hoping to protect, is really, as I say in the piece, in the eye of the beholder. And I bring up Barbara Jordan for a second reason. She was one of the first African-American women elected to the House of Representatives, and she brought to the public discourse some attention to her particular experience. I won't recount the narrative she offered in the impeachment hearings for President Nixon, but it really was a powerful statement to reframe what we understand the Constitution to stand for, because it stands for people who were reflected, right, among the people who signed the founding document, but they're also, at least certainly then in the 1970s, she was speaking on behalf of a group of people who were relegated to a particular marginalized space. Now, I'm not trying to do a constitutional law lecture. We have the dean next to me, you could do that. What I am offering, though, is the point about our discourse about election integrity now. The people who invoke that, more often than not, are talking about a justification, a principle to justify policies that keep people out. And it's based on an assumption that only certain people belong in the electoral community. And so I spent some time talking about that principle through a particular lens, and it's something I've been obsessed with as of late, historically black colleges and universities. Didn't attend one, but I grew up in a neighborhood with like a third of the faculty at Alabama State. I grew up in Montgomery. But what you learn through their eyes often is obviously a particular history of what it meant to pursue excellence in a system that didn't believe in your excellence. And often, and this is what the piece really focuses on, you're also doing it in a space where the state is invoking its power to keep your community out of the political process. And that takes us back as far as Gamillion versus Lightfoot, which actually was focused on Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. So I talk a little bit about that history, but I do it not just to talk about history, but to talk about how election integrity rules, moving polling places, putting police at places where young black students are voting. Those efforts send messages, and they are not savory messages. And they have become, of course, as has been written about in the book, more prevalent in the absence of the Voting Rights Act. So it's really an invitation to rethink election integrity. And I'll stop by just offering the point about the thing that keeps me up at night. more than anything, it's misinformation and disinformation. And that takes a lot of forms. I know there's a piece about AI, but there's also that version of disinformation that comes from the state. And I will just offer, feel free to ask me about it, all the different ways in which state actors now are attempting to interfere with the free flow of information for the public to do its job in the political space. That is to decide what it wants, not just about candidates, but about issues. And in places where the public has an effort through direct democracy to find reform opportunities on issues ranging from the structure of government to reproductive rights, you see people who have, as I say, the badges and the hats, officials using government power to muddy up the communications process. That's really a danger, and it's as much, in my view, a danger as AI.
Thank you for that, and I think we'll come back to disinformation, but I just wanted to follow up on one thing. One point you make is about the importance of HBCUs for the future of those students who go there, and the way in which they tend to populate some of the most important jobs, tend to have success in whatever field they choose. And so by going after that population, it's not really just about the election or about who's getting elected, and you make that point, so I just wanted to make it for you and remind you. Okay, so yeah. Trevor, let's turn to you. Sure. Okay, sorry. Trevor, let's turn to you and ask you the same question. And then I'm going to have a follow-up because I have a couple of questions about your essay that I'm going to push you on. But just, how do you define election integrity? And, what do you see as the thing that worries you the most about the election that is in a frighteningly few weeks away?
Great questions. And I don't think there is just one answer to any of them. It's true about many systems, and I think true of ours, that some of the strengths of our system are also their weaknesses. So Julian talked about sort of threats at the local level. So, this massive, complicated democracy of ours is one whose national elections are conducted by state and local officials, many of them volunteers. And so when there are credible threats towards the security of those folks, there can be lots of reasons to worry. When there are credible threats to the integrity of those processes, there can be lots of reasons to worry. It's also true, somewhat ironically, that incredibly decentralized and heterogeneous in the sense of different voting systems used in different jurisdictions, even within the same state, for example, relatively low-tech system is also a strength. If the single threat that you were most worried about was sort of hacking of our elections, our national elections are a lot less hackable in certain ways, not totally unhackable, but a lot less hackable than they would be if, say, they were entirely nationally administered through a centralized online process that was entirely digital, that would have certain elements of security for sure, but that would be more exploitable in other ways. So I think we need to think about the risks of undermining the integrity of administration of elections at the local level. I think we also need to think, just to pick up on the disinformation point for a moment, about the current environment we're in, which is it's not principally about elections, it's about our democracy more broadly, but there is a kind of month by month continued erosion of public trust in the knowability of a common truth. In the knowability of a common set of facts. We may interpret things differently, but Senator Moynihan's point that you're entitled to your own opinion but not to your own facts, I think is still morally true in the sense that no one is morally entitled to their own facts. But it is less and less descriptively true. We have candidates who are operating on the basis of the assertion of their own facts. We have enormous parts of our polity that are operating on the understanding that their facts are the facts, even though they are totally at odds with the facts of other members of this same polity. And in some large and amorphous way, the thing that worries me most is trying to conduct an election, indeed trying to run a government in the midst of that kind of not just uncertainty or disinformation, but the malicious propagation of misinformation for nefarious purposes. This is happening by domestic actors, it's happening by international actors, many of which have realized that they don't need to directly hack our election and to change the electoral count to undermine faith and confidence in the result of elections, to create a space of uncertainty that can be exploited for any number of reasons. And I am deeply worried that the next 4 months will see the exploitation of that vulnerability.
No, I think that's really an important point, that when we think about what can go wrong from interference, from disinformation, it's really about creating chaos and confusion. It's not about anything else. That in and of itself is such an undermining of the democratic process.
It may not be sufficient to change the outcome of an election, but it is a sort of opening salvo that will do institutional damage and can create the space for all kinds of bad things to happen.
So one of the things that you keep coming back to in your essay is the idea that, yeah, we have all these great institutions, that's wonderful, they're supposed to function, but what about people in charge and in leadership that would that actually follow the laws and the Constitution? And you keep trying in your, I'll let you talk about that, but there is a sense that you keep coming back to that. So what is it? Is it good people? Is it good, can good people override institutional fissures and faults like we've seen, or is that just rose-colored glasses?
Yeah, big question also. So my chapter in this book is about the role of the president. And so we have these two, the title of the book invokes these two things, right? Election integrity and national security. And the standard picture would be the most important caretaker of our national security is the President of the United States. If you had to pick one person who was most responsible for that, and who, by dint of their office, is in the greatest position to do the most to secure the national security, you would say the president. And even though our national elections are not administered at the national level, the president also, sort of as conventionally understood, I think has an incredibly important role in trying to ensure the integrity of our electoral process overall. The president sits atop the federal executive branch, oversees the Department of Justice, which has responsibility for enforcing all the federal voting rights laws and laws having to do with electoral integrity, addressing risks real and perceived. Oversees the Department of Homeland Security, which has offices devoted to things like the cyber integrity of our electoral processes and the like. So that's the president as protector of our national security and therefore our electoral integrity insofar as electoral integrity is part of national security. The experience of the 2020 election cycle was an experience of the president as principal threat to all of those things. And I didn't really think I could write a chapter about the president and these topics without taking it from that vantage point. And so the difficulty is this. The president plays no direct role, has no lawful authority to oversee the administration of our elections, but does sit atop the federal executive branch, which has immense authority and which can be used in abusive ways that could have profound implications for election outcomes. And the story of the 2020 election and its aftermath was many stories, but one of them was the attempt by the President of the United States to use the power of his office to subvert our democracy. I wrote the chapter before the Supreme Court had decided its presidential immunity case, Trump versus the United States, but it was in the middle of litigation of that, so I was anticipating it. One of the challenging things for me is I don't think it's a correct view of the law to say that there's no such thing as presidential immunity. Our Constitution, properly understood, does assign the president some roles as to which he has exclusive responsibility, and Congress cannot interfere with them, and therefore he could not be regulated, whether criminally or otherwise, in discharge of those functions. They are few and far between, and they have nothing to do with elections. Had I been in a position to shape the Supreme Court's opinion, it would have proceeded on that basis, on the basis of a recognition that there is something called presidential immunity from criminal liability, but it's narrow, and beyond that, it's really up to Congress to set our laws, and the president's role is to enforce those laws, not to act in violation of them and then claim that his office immunizes him for it. Nevertheless, despite the Supreme Court's immunity decision, and despite my I've written an essay on lawfare, enumerating all of my disagreements with what the court did there. The other thing I tried to emphasize in the chapter, and that you brought up, Karen, and that the story of the 2020 election highlights is that even when a president is determined to use his office to try and stay in office in violation of the Constitution and laws, to upend the results of a free and fair election, his capacity to do that at the end of the day, even the President of the United States, who is certainly the most powerful human in the world, depends not simply on that president's will to power. It depends on whether the people serving in his government will do as he asks or as he directs. And an undertold story, not untold, but I think underappreciated story of true heroism is the role played by a number of key lawyers and other advisors within the Trump administration in November and December of 2020 and January of 2021 that stopped him from doing what he wanted to do, which was, among other things, to sic the Justice Department on states whose election results were not what he wanted, was to install slates of fake electors, was to invoke the Insurrection Act and potentially have our military in the streets as a way to retain power after what should have been Inauguration Day for President Biden. Those things didn't happen in very substantial part because senior members of the Trump administration simply refused to go along and told him that he would be presiding over an empty government because they would all resign en masse. Had those things not happened, the country today would be in a far worse place.
So that's what I call the glass half full, but appreciate it. So Julian, you've read and written and thought a lot about leadership and about the role of the president, but also the role of the courts and the role of Congress. And I'm just wondering, moving on to not just the threats giving up to the election, but this is an unfair question, I know, but how you see these institutions rising to the occasion if they need to, given what we've seen recently with the Supreme Court, given what we've seen with Congress that seems to be at best, unable to move forward with anything, at best at a stalemate. How do you see this as related to the election, and what are your worries and your lack of worries?
More worries than lack of worries. So, let me take it two ways. One is, I think, a big part of the book, and we really, just to give context, tried to bring some of the best and brightest together to really give serious consideration to this issue we're talking about, and it's dealt with in the media all the time, but serious consideration of the kind of historical look. And one of the findings is our democracy is in many ways a model and very good, but it's very frail. And we kind of go through different parts where you can see way before 2020, this system can be broken. It has been broken, and you can look at it in different elements. You have an essay on contested and messy elections that have happened several times in U.S. history, such as in 1876 as an example. My essay on voting rights, it's about this fundamental right is something we have been very reluctant to actually extend. The only reason we get to 1965 is through, blood and tears. And Jim Crow was in place for many, many decades, enforced with a brutal system. So you can go through each element of the election, and you see how fragile it is. So how do you kind of make sure it works? Part of it is, do you treat the institutions in ways that diminish the weaknesses and elevate the strengths? And we have an essay on the electoral reform that passed in 2022. It's one example. We're actually trying to fix it. I write about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which unfortunately has been reversed. But the history shows it takes a lot sometimes for leaders to protect this system. There have been really the wrong incentives. Sometimes suppression is more attractive than citizenship. Robert Moses, who was one of the great civil rights activists in Mississippi, used to talk about, I'm writing about him now, constitutional personhood. And one of the great questions of this country was, would we recognize that? And would the federal government protect it? I think the answer too often has been not. And now we're in a place where 2020, one of the things Trump does, I think, is expose weaknesses. And he exposed a lot of weaknesses in our political system. He's willing to exploit them. And that's one part of the story. But part of the story is what exactly is he exploiting and why is it exploitable? And the three institutions you point to, and I would add the media and broader than the media, just our communication sphere, I don't have great faith. I think we saw how we can't necessarily have confidence in the executive branch being able or in some cases willing to uphold the electoral will of the country. The court has moved in the wrong direction. I mean, just look at voting rights. The court has, undermined one of the great pieces of legislation in American history. It opened the doors exactly to what Justice Ginsburg warned. That's what's happened in many states. And so the court is more, I think, right now reactionary, obviously, on these kinds of questions, and we saw it with presidential immunity. They did act well, the courts, in 2020 in stopping the effort to overturn it, but we're in a different place now. Congress, certainly many House Republicans and Senate Republicans have embraced election denialism with gusto. There's an article today, I can't remember where, about concerns about what happens if the House Republicans win, Vice President Harris wins by a narrow margin. This is contested. What's going to happen with the Speaker Johnson, who will be under immense pressure, who himself was supportive of 2020? So all these institutions, I think, there's open questions right now. I do believe Vice President Harris would protect the system, but she is not alone. She faces a hostile environment, and our communication system, finally, is just full of holes. It's full of holes. We live in a filterless communication environment right now, where it's very easy to get information out. And we saw in 2020 how a poll worker in a state, at a locality, can find themselves in the middle of a national frenzy that ends up threatening them because someone wants to say something or tweet something out. So I know that's a lot of doom and gloom, but coming back finally to Bob Moses of SNCC, one of the other lessons was not just his fears and concerns, but nothing stopped him, and he understood the power ultimately of voters, of well-intentioned citizens, to make sure that doesn't happen. And I still think that will be the answer. The lawyers are heroic and they're really important, but ultimately it will require the vigilance of the democracy to save the democracy.
So that's interesting, because you're saying both it's up to the voters, but that beyond that, it has to be up to some structural fixes. Okay. So Kareem, I want to turn to you on that point, which is, the Voting Rights Act is one of many things that have happened to degrade the elections. Voter suppression, if you think about so many vulnerabilities, they come into the basket of voter suppression in so many different ways. Do you think any of these incremental fixes, the ECRA that Julian referred to, or other things that we read about that have been done here and there to protect the disinformation that can, like, here's a number you can call if you don't know where your poll is, et cetera, et cetera. Do you perceive that there's been some incremental and potentially effective addressing of these vulnerabilities in this last couple of months' effort to make this a, whole election?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure if I'm going to be as doom and gloom as Julian was, although I think I agree with your read of a lot of the history. My read of this moment is we are doing the best we can with what we have. So in many spaces, we are trying to find, in often bipartisan ways, answers that can move through the legislative process to get what change we can to try as best we can to protect our system. There is no substitute, however, for confidence. That is, our confidence in a system and, frankly, our confidence in each other. And that's that information challenge I think we have, right? We aren't just sort of being misinformed about policy. We are sadly, as the recent days have shown, being misinformed about each other, who's a danger to our well-being. And that's a deeper problem, right? I mean, one of the things that I feel like we've never really had, at least in as virulent form as we now see, is a sort of public discourse where pretty much name your group. You have almost like a 31 flavors Baskin-Robbins list of who should we be afraid of this week. And that's not a basis on which you can ever, A, set up a coalition, or B, come up with policies that, we might not all love from our particular perspectives, but it's something we can agree to. And that, to me, is sort of the foundation of what we need as a sort of polity to get things done. So, yes, the ECRA and provisions like it are helpful. We have, of course, in the private sphere, people across party lines joining hands to say, our election integrity that is the maintenance of a free and fair election is a good thing, and we should all, regardless of who we want to be president, embrace that. I think it's also fair to say, if we're thinking about religion, and religion has been used in a lot of different ways, we see people from the more progressive and from the conservative angles joining hands to agree in some limited ways of the protection of the election being a priority. And they're speaking to their congregations about it. I think that's an important thing too. Civil society has to step up and be a part of it. None of that, however, is going to be a long-range substitute. We will get lucky. We will have people in government who will stand up for what is right in a moment. We will have people in, the civil space to say, look, we don't like that a community is being demonized. We're going to go and try to support that community. But none of that steps in to deal with a real structural problem we have, which is we are, unfortunately, in a moment where people see incentive to undermine a system where the majority of people in a polity, whether it's a state or a country, are able to work their will through elections. And that's a problem, because that's sort of the point of democracy. And I say that, and I want to just build on the point I made earlier about direct democracy. Not every state has it, but there are plenty of states that allow for the people to engage in initiatives, and that essentially does an end run around legislatures that might themselves be locked up due to gerrymandering. And where that happens, you see a problem where the legislature tries to undermine the ability of those initiatives to go forward, which is in many places the only route where it exists for the people to say, no, we can't do it that way. So it's a real problem. There are a lot of different structural reforms out there, but I don't think we can get there unless we have an election this time where people feel confident, regardless of the party that you belong to or who you prefer to be elected, that you think we've had a fair enough shake, and as Lonnie Guinier used to say, and we're willing to hold hands and do it again. Because if we're not ready to do that, then we don't have a democracy.
Yeah, that's interesting, though, because you all keep raising the idea of, getting the message out that's honest and true and has some integrity to it. But, but you're also worried about election interference, election disinformation, and how that can work. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's actually, what's your idea about how to counter disinformation? Is it, some people say we need to make our schools better, we need to educate our students better. Some people would say we need to just unplug some of the media in various forms. Others would say, well, we have to wait and pass some laws. But is there anything in particular that you think would be a fix, maybe not in the short term, but in the longer term, to help address this issue of malinformation, disinformation, misinformation?
Is that question to me?
Yes.
I can give you two things briefly, because I want to hear what other people think too.
No, don't worry.
I think there's some work that we need to do in the private sphere. One of the things that, if you're interested, I feel like we've got to start now. And I'm so glad you brought up the point, Karen, about the role that some of these election integrity regimes can place in essentially demobilizing students at schools, who many of them are exercising their right to vote or trying to for the first time. That sets a tone. And I think in the opposite way, we can start encouraging young people who are about to enter the electorate to understand the importance, not just of voting, it's an important piece of it, but all the things you do attendant to voting before you get to election day. So one answer I'm working on is working on video games. Kids like games, meet them where they are. Try to build creative ways in which you help people understand the relevance of not just voting, a significant part of it, but also being a citizen. And yes, there also need to be some structural changes. I'm not very happy at all with the court's understanding of political speech. I'm sure I'm going to start a fight, but it is an assumption that we've always had in the law that more speech is better and the people will figure it out. I think our current era shows the real fallacy in that when it comes to people who are focused on disinformation as a political strategy. So I think that needs to change too.
If I just jump, I mean, I do think it's a leadership question too. I mean, this is a role where we need leaders who, look, politicians lie all the time. You have the Gulf of Tonkin as one of the great examples, but we're in a different space now where it's pure disinformation that is often coming and being embraced. And I think if you don't have leaders pushing back against this and saying, well, this information stream is not something I'm going to engage in, it's really hard. You can reform a million things, you can teach a million classes, but you just need one president or one speaker or one leader to embrace these ideas, and it's very hard to curtail. And that's an unsatisfactory answer because you need to find those leaders. But I think that's why guardrails are important. Adam Berinsky's a political scientist who has a new book about this, and he argues in terms of news how effective it would be to have leaders who are just not taking this stuff as serious. And I think ultimately that's going to be a big part of the answer.
Trevor, you want to weigh in on that? I mean, one of the things that happened just before, so you could think about your answer, one of the things is that the federal government very quietly sends out a lot of memos, a lot of statements to try to educate officials, to educate, at the local level, to address your first point. They don't do this in a, they don't put it in the New York Times. They just sort of want to take responsibility for, this is what disinformation can look like, this is where we think it's coming from. Is that enough of leadership? Again, it's the federal government, so they do have to be somewhat, quiet about it and not get too invasive. But, okay, over to you, Trevor.
This is a huge problem,
Yeah.
obviously. I agree. I'm using my mic. I agree that disinformation as a general problem has multiple layers, and that it probably can't be solved just by one actor or institution. I agree that it takes leadership and it takes some arranging of the incentives so that opponents find a self-interested reason to cooperate. If what we're waiting for is for the two political parties to become altruistic and self-sacrificing, then we're going to wait a long time for a solution to any important problem. So we need, and it would be rational for the two sides, say, to see that the downsides of their suffering from disinformation are to each of them greater than the upsides of benefiting from it. So it's an asymmetric problem, and that calls out for rational decision-making and leadership and coming together. And one of the things that could be on is thinking through how the law ought to allocate responsibility to social media platforms for the content that they provide a platform for. This is, in the current legal landscape, this is the so-called Section 230 question. Right now, social media platforms are basically held immune from any legal responsibility for the content of the speech that they enable. So they don't bear a responsibility, Twitter or X, whatever it's called, doesn't bear a responsibility for the content of the tweets, legal responsibility. Facebook, same, et cetera. This question went up to the Supreme Court recently, and the court mostly kind of ducked it. The 9 justices, I think, were a little bit like deers in the headlight, staring straight at this thing and thought, boy, we're not actually sure how to answer this question. I don't think the courts are the ideal place to answer this question in the first instance. I think the best thing that could happen, I don't hold a great hope that will happen anytime soon, is that the federal legislature recognized that we're in quite a different world than the world we were in even when this provision, Section 230, was passed, and a more comprehensive new legal framework for addressing this problem be addressed. What would that be? To what end would that be a means? it would, and here I agree quite with something that Kareem said, this wouldn't be figuring out how to get more accurate information out into the marketplace on the theory that let's just counter bad information with good and the public will sort it. The way communications happens today puts real pressure on that idea. And it's not to say we have to be opposed to free speech, but I think we have to say, are there other ways to counter bad, harmful, maliciously propagated disinformation than just putting out accurate information, because the ability of the average member of the public to sort one from the other is being undermined hourly. So a comprehensive change in the legal framework that would hold social media platforms more responsible for the most grotesquely inaccurate and intentionally so information on their platforms would be a place to start and give them an economic incentive for living up to that responsibility. I think we need legislative change to get there. And there may even be a majority of those elected in Congress who agree that that ought to happen, but there's not yet a will to work together across the aisle to get us there. I can't claim to be optimistic that it'll happen. The best reason to think that it might happen is that it's totally devastating if we don't do it.
So, none of you sound, terribly optimistic about this election, but I want to move on to the transition period, because I think one of the things that, when you say election integrity, one of the first things that come to mind is January 6th and what happened on January 6th. And so the question is not so much, do we expect another January 6th, although feel free to talk about that, but sort of, do we have in place, ECRA being one of the things that could have helped us with that, do you think we have in place the kinds of safeguards that we need to prevent another January 6th, remembering that much of what didn't happen on January 6th had to do with actions and steps that President Trump took to dismantle the system that could have responded in a different way. So I'm just curious how each one of you think that, because you see a lot of newspaper coverage of it, and do you think we're ready this time? And we know what the threats are. Julian?
I think, let me just start by saying I still, the fact that we had not just January 6th, but everything surrounding it, the fact it's still a possibility, like a real one, not a fake one, that's incredible to me as someone who teaches history to students, that this is now part of our rhetoric, our understanding of American politics. And that's why I always come back to, we need to take it very seriously. It just happened, and it shouldn't. We've moved the window into a whole new realm, and so I think that's important to just process. Every now and then we just talk about it like, do we think there's going to be another January 6th? And it's like, oh my God, that's where we are now. It's not who will win the election, will you have a shift to the right or left. It's like, will the election be upheld? But I think there are safeguards. I mean, look, there are concrete legislative safeguards. I do think the electoral count reform put into place certain provisions that clarifies what you can or can't do. It's not a perfect safeguard, as you're seeing already. There's lots of holes, but it's something. It's tighter than it used to be. I think, B, last election is part of a possible safeguard, meaning now we're more cognizant of how this can go poorly. And we're more cognizant of what are the different tricks and strategies that can be used, and people are more aware of it because they are taking it seriously. And we know the playbook. I understand it can change, but I actually think that becomes something of a safeguard. In 2020, when I remember Bart Gellman had an article about this in the Atlantic, and everyone was like, oh, come on. And he actually outlined a lot of what was going to happen. It didn't work, but he outlined it. Now we have a real case, and I think real cases are very helpful, actually, for people who don't want that to happen again. And finally, back to civil society, I do think there are a lot of groups who are, they have their eye on this right now. You have different legal organizations that are ready. They're ready to protect the vote. They're ready to take on legal challenges. You have many people in the political arena who are focused on the integrity of the election and making sure there's nothing like that and not just the outcome. And so if there is hope, and you look, the Democratic Party has invested a lot at this point in kind of combating efforts to have this happen again. So I think there are ways in which we are better prepared, and being better prepared ultimately is probably the most vital safeguard in case this is attempted again.
All right, we're going to turn to some audience questions and then maybe come back to that ray of hope that you just put out there. So, I mean, I have to say the first two questions are very much along the lines of what we were just talking about. But actually, Kareem, this is a good one for you. What is your dream scenario, are you ready for this, for how voting infrastructure and policy could best address the issues you've outlined?
Wow. Well, that's, yeah, it is a big question.
Yeah.
I don't mind offering a dream scenario. I think the key to this is having a system in which we can have people, regardless of your political persuasion, join hands to say there's a system reform that actually we can all agree to that's going to, get us from where we are to something that is different. Now, there's a whole story to be told about that. Sometimes uncertainty supports that. I'm now appreciating Trevor's point about rational choice theory. It's good to invest in people not knowing quite what the outcome is going to be and seeing it possible that they can succeed. If they think it's rigged, sorry to use the phrase, you're not going to be able to get that. So what's my scenario? My scenario certainly aligns with the Brennan Center's two major legislative commitments. We are big and heavy in favor of the Freedom to Vote Act and the Voting Rights Act extension, which is named for John Lewis. Those two particular legislative changes are absolutely crucial to shift the way in which we understand how elections are run. I frankly think we should start our conversation about how our structures operate in Congress. There are conversations going on about the filibuster. I think that needs to be reconsidered. I think now this is talking as Kareem and not the vice president of DC for Brennan. We need to really, answer the question about whether or not the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico need to be states. Those are big questions about our polity, but they go to the question of whether or not the people who are here are people who are entitled to have their views represented. And there's plenty of argument about why both of those jurisdictions have been undervalued. And we can think carefully about how to do it, but those are two structural changes that I think the legislative piece and the statehood piece, and I guess I've also thrown in the filibuster to be considered, that could at least get us to a space where we can have conversations about election policy.
And what about, Trevor, I'm going to ask you this one, so get ready. What about the Electoral College? Usually when people, one of the facts I love most about the book is in the last essay by Russ Feingold and Lindsay Langholtz, in which, they say that the issue that has been most brought up before Congress since the founding of the country is reforming or getting rid of, depending on the spectrum you're looking at, the Electoral College. You know how many times? 800. So, it's just staggering that how much we've had this conversation. So how should we think about reforming the Electoral College? And then I'm going to ask Julian the same thing, so don't worry.
Sure. So I'm going to say some unpopular things first, I bet. It's remarked a lot, I think, in some of the chapters and certainly more broadly in public debate, how many of the elections in recent times, presidential elections in recent times, have had a divergence between the winner of the Electoral College and the winner of the national public vote, as evidence of what's wrong with the Electoral College. I think there is a deep problem with that line of criticism. It's, to me, roughly like watching two people play a game of chess and observing that white won, and then saying, but you know what, if they had been playing checkers, black would have won. If the national vote total is what mattered, both candidates would campaign in radically different ways than the way they campaign now. Basically, no one would go to Iowa. The Republican candidate would spend an immense amount of time in New York, which he does not, and the Republican candidate, and the Democratic candidate would spend an immense amount of time in states that are reliably red. because it would matter that you could run up your vote there even if you didn't win the state overall. And so the idea that we kind of know who would win the elections if we were not operating on the basis of an electoral college, but were instead operating on the basis of a national popular vote, I think to me is just not a case that's been made. That doesn't mean the electoral college is a good thing. Right, it's not surprising that our system, if you think about the basis on which the Constitution of the United States was established and the kind of union it brought into being, it's not surprising that the states are treated as the building blocks, and therefore who wins within a state is kind of what matters, because the states are the constitutive elements that form the union of the United States. But of course, we are in a very different place today than we were in the late 18th century, and even if that was a good idea then, it might well not be a good idea now when we experience problems as national and we expect a government to be representative of that national polity, and when the sort of extremity of population difference is many times greater today from one state to the next than it was when the Union was founded. The most populous state, California, is so many times more populous than the least populous state, which I guess is Wyoming, Montana, one of those. There was no disparity anywhere near that. And when you think about, in particular, how racial demography and socioeconomic demography sort of overlays over that, there's a particular kind of pattern of disempowering that happens by our reliance on the Electoral College, and that, for me, would be the case for thinking about its reform. There's an idea of trying to accomplish this reform without actually eliminating it from the Constitution, but a compact among states that would say, with sufficient number, if you decide to apportion your electors in your state according to the vote percentages within your state rather than doing winner take all, which states can do right now. They just don't have an incentive to do it. If you do it, then I'll do it, and we will sort of create a national popular vote mechanism without amending the Constitution. I don't think this change is coming anytime soon, because I think both political parties rightfully see it, I'm afraid, in zero-sum terms. It's because they think they know the result of what the national popular vote would be if we flip to this system. I'm suspicious about that. I think they don't. And maybe if we all appreciated that there was a little more uncertainty in what would happen, the odds of adopting the change would go up.
Interesting. Julian, you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I mean, look, I don't disagree with a lot of what Trevor said. Obviously, the only question is if it would change it in that the Republicans have a narrower kind of electoral base at this point because of the nature of the appeal. That would be the only way to think that the Electoral College being gone might change outcomes.
Sorry, but you'd even get out the vote differently, so I don't even know if we know that.
No, it's true. Yeah. It's true, but I'm not optimistic that's going to happen. I mean, the lesson of how many times it's been proposed and how many times it becomes a salient issue right after the elections you write about, like 2000, and then fades very quickly, to me is an indication, not that it's wrong to think about, but it's just not on the table right now, and we have too many kind of big problems with concrete solutions. I think that we should focus on those. And if I'm prioritizing, and I realize I wrote about it, for me it's still restoring the Voting Rights Act, which should be front and center, very doable. We had it, and we had it until parts were picked away. And ultimately, in terms of confidence, even confidence that the Electoral College system as it works is working, really depends on Americans feeling that they can vote, that the vote will be respected, and that the vote won't be prohibitive to exercise that right. And I think if we kind of went to some version of the John Lewis Act, some version of that, but again, it's just restoring 1965, that would be, for me, much more of a priority right now, and I think it's achievable, and I would start there.
Karen, can I jump in and realize two things? One, I'm in a law school, and two, Michael Waldman, our president and CEO of the Brennan Center, isn't here, but were he here, he'd offer to all of us another reform, and I don't think any of the reforms that we've talked about can reliably stick when we have a Supreme Court that is out of control. And I think it's worth are mentioning the fact that, structural reform requires a court that's willing to actually abide by the constitutional guide rails that are out there and actually take care to think through our history and the application of law as, I think most of us who, went to law school have understood it. We don't have that right now. I know the dean was on a panel with Michael that was charged to think about, I think it's probably the fairest way to say it, ways of reforming the court. I think Michael, has offered a great argument for a reform that doesn't require a constitutional amendment, but at least an attention to Supreme Court replacement that's based on term limits. Congress, I'm persuaded, can do it through statute, but the importance of having change on the court does two things. One, it brings in new and different perspectives, but two, it takes us out of what we've been talking about, this polarized sense that, if you win something, I have to lose something, but rather giving every president over the course of time the ability to appoint someone and to have on a regular and sort of predictable basis, based on the election outcomes, the opportunity to choose new people on the court. What we have right now is a court that's locked in, that has a particularly, in my view, retrograde understanding of society and the Constitution, and I don't think we get any of these reforms in a reliable way with a court that's not really bent on interpreting the law in a manner that really thinks about voters and the dignity of people, but instead, for example, looks at the dignity of states as its driving consideration.
Trevor, you want to comment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad Kareem brought that up. I agree very much that part of the conversation about fortifying our democracy and our electoral processes should include discussion of Supreme Court reform. And Kareem mentioned President Biden's commission on the Supreme Court that Michael Waldman served on, that I served on, that Rick Pildes on our faculty served on, other friends of the Brennan Center. We weren't asked to come up with a reform proposal to propose. We were asked to sort of analyze and evaluate them, and so we produced a document that did that, but didn't really stump strongly for any one particular reform. But I will say my own experience with that was to come away convinced that from the standpoint of first principles, or like a sensible constitutional democracy, of course the Supreme Court justices should be term limited. We are the only major constitutional democracy in the world whose high court judges are not either subject to a mandatory retirement age or term limited. There's just no justification for not doing that, and so there are lots of upsides. I think a major one is that there would be a feeling that over time, who is on the Supreme Court is a result of the political will of the people as expressed through elections, because with every 4-year presidential cycle, the most common of these proposals say if you have a 9-member court, you end up having 18-year terms for each justice, and every 2 years a new vacancy comes up and is filled. And there's lots to be worked out in terms of how you transition from the system we have now to then. I think there is at least a credible argument to be made that it can be done by legislation. If the country could get its act together to amend the Constitution to provide for this, I would prefer that, frankly, because it would sit on surer footing. But I think the legislative mode is at least defensible. This very Supreme Court we want to reform, I have to remind us, will be the one to decide whether Congress can do it by legislation. And so we shouldn't get our hopes too very high up. But if this happened, it would mean that we would feel that over time, the outcomes of the presidential elections would produce not necessarily Trump justices or Harris justices or whatever, but just justices who came through a nominating process that was responsive in terms of who was doing the nominating to who won the most recent national election for president. And that over time, I think, is more likely to produce a court that is seen as legitimate. And I care about that for a number of reasons, but one is the experience of late 2020 and early 2021. The courts did play an immensely central role in ensuring that the results of the 2020 election were not upended. If the 62 out of 63 court decisions that Trump lost had gone the other way, President Biden wouldn't be president. And it's not the person of President Biden. Our democracy would have failed. And what we need is a country that has faith in the capacity of our courts to ensure that those failures don't happen. And so the cost, those who bear the cost of the lost legitimacy of the court are ultimately all of us, because we live in a system that needs a court system that is viewed as legitimate. And so Supreme Court reform needs to be part of the discussion of fortifying our democracy.
So we're out of time, but Julian, I just want to get you to weigh in on that. You write about Supreme Court cases a lot and how they've affected the voting rights and voting system itself. Do you agree? And I'm glad to see that Trevor's so optimistic now.
I am. I mean, well, it's interesting to see kind of more parts of the legal community talking about these kinds of judicial reforms, where even a few years ago it wasn't really on the map, and it's not even kind of the world of activists. It's the world of thoughtful, comparative legal scholars who's thinking this through. And so, look, I am supportive. I don't know, there's certain reforms that politically are very difficult. Expanding the court is one that instantly triggers a lot of concern and fears. But the idea of term limits, it might sound grandiose, but I think Trevor said it well. It's very normal. We're the ones who are off on how we do this. So I do think it has to be part of the package. And I'm going to say one last thing, which is a bit of a plug for the book. But I mean, seriously, I mean, part of what we wanted to do, and I hope people pick up a copy, is there are a lot of thoughtful people in the academy who are really working through these questions. And the idea of the book, coming back to the first question, was to bring these in accessible ways for readers who are not just interested in learning more, but might devote a little time after to doing something, even having a conversation with friends or workers, to however they participate in the political process. These essays really are incredibly good at all the different parts of this democracy we all care about so much. And I think Karen and I both hope, we have great authors, the two you just heard, that these books begin that kind of conversation. And that, look, Ella Baker, go back to the 60s, always said great political movements really start with people, with average people. That's when they work, when they become invested in the bigger questions. And I think democracy is no different. And a very small hope with a book like this, but it's a bigger point, is we all have to do that starting today, have those conversations, become invested, and in the ways we can, make sure that come November, whatever the voters decide, genuinely decide, that is the outcome that we live with.
So those are perfect. Those are perfect concluding remarks. I think the takeaway from the book and from this conversation, which I think you heard very in graphic detail, is that the reason this election is so important isn't just because of the candidates that are running, but because there is so much that's fragile about our democratic institutions that are coming to coalesce on this election. And if we get through it, and we get through it in a robust way and get to the other side of January 6th, it will be an amazing accomplishment. And this election, therefore, is a great opportunity. So vote. Thank you for coming. It was a pleasure to be here. Stay for the